On behalf of all of us at the Tepper School, I'm John Sangenberger, Executive Director of the Alumni Relations. I want to welcome you to our Tepper webinar series with our alumni panel with Professor Chris Telmer and three of our alumni experts on reopening the economy. We're glad to have so many of our alumni from the Tepper School, as well as from Carnegie Mellon University, and even some of our current students joining us today. We are committed to providing lifelong learning opportunities for our alumni with our outstanding faculty and alumni experts. So we want to welcome you back to our virtual classroom today. Again, questions were submitted in advance and we appreciate that. For others, we'll be able to add some as we go along during the presentation. First, we have some great news. We're delighted to announce the selection of our new dean at the Tepper School of Business, Dr. Isabelle Bajuz. She is currently the Dean and Professor of Finance at McGill University up in the Montreal, Canada area. She's part of leading the Desaltes Faculty of Management there, and she'll be beginning her role as the 10th Dean of the Tepper School of Business on October 15th. There's been some great articles about her, so we encourage you to follow the links on the page or check out our website and be able to connect with our great Dean. She presented to all of us on the school yesterday. We also wanted to make you aware of our outstanding calendar of events for our executive ed program. So if you're looking for an opportunity for either one of our open enrollment programs or a custom one for your company, we have got some great programs available for you, and there's a special alumni discount for all of you, both on the open enrollment programs and the custom programs for your company. We also have a couple of upcoming webinars we want to tell you about. First of all, Laura Maxwell, who is one of our leadership coaches and one of the founders of the Accelerate Leadership Center, is going to talk about how to manage and be managed virtually, an empathetic approach. So I think all of us are adjusting to the changes in this virtual remote world, and I think you're going to enjoy that. When we resume in September, we have two of our professors from our organizational behavior department, Brandy Avens and Denise Rousseau, and they're going to talk about how is societal behavior during and after the pandemic changing. So they'll be looking at it from an organizational behavior view. That's going to be on the 29th. We'll have more information for you as it comes along. Now let me introduce our panelists for today. First, let me introduce our faculty host, Dr. Chris Telmer. Many of you may have had him for finance. He's an associate professor of financial economics here at the Tepper School and head of our economics department. He joined the Tepper School faculty in 1993. An outstanding scholar, he's received both the undergraduate teaching award in 1995 and the MBA teaching award in 2001. He is currently the associate editor at European Economic Review and the Journal of Financial Economics, and he has been a visiting scholar in the Federal Reserve System and universities in Canada, Chile, Spain, Japan, and Sweden. So he's been a great advisor. We're really excited to have him with us today. Another one of our Canadian faculty members. Let me introduce Gunjan Kedia. Gunjan is Vice President of Wealth Management Investment Services at U.S. Bank. She's a 1994 graduate of the Tepper School and a member of this business school's Business Board of Advisors. She began her career after Tepper in consulting with PwC and then with McKinsey and with financial institutions. And then she transitioned to Executive Vice President and Head of Global Product Management at the Bank of New York Mellon, then joined State Street in Boston as Head of Investment Servicing before joining her current role. So glad to have you with us. And then Shubham Singhal is a Senior Partner at the Detroit office and Global Leader of Healthcare Systems and Services Practices at McKinsey and Company. He's a 1999 graduate of the Tepper School and joined McKinsey right after graduation. In his role, he counsels leading healthcare organizations on strategy, growth, M&A, business building, and large-scale performance transformation. He also leads McKinsey's thinking and research on the future of healthcare and has been a part of their thought leadership initiative on reopening the economy. And last but not least, Paul Wellner. Paul is currently Vice Chairman with Deloitte and leads their U.S. industrial products and construction practice with Deloitte Consulting. And he serves companies that range from heavy equipment to aerospace and defense, industrial products, and construction. He's a 1986 graduate and joined TRW before joining Deloitte 3 years later. He has more than 3 decades of experience and drives their key industries initiatives to adapt to the rapidly changing economy and Business 4.0. He's based in Cleveland, also serves as the managing principal of the Northeast Ohio office, and served as president of the Tepper School Alumni Board. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce these outstanding speakers to you, and I'm going to hand off to Professor Telmer and our alumni panel now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Welcome, everybody. So I'm just going to set the stage in terms of kind of where we're at right now in terms of the economy, and looking very much forward to the insights that our panelists have to offer. So where are we at? Unfortunately, not where we were 6 weeks ago, when Goldman Sachs was predicting a 20% unemployment rate for May, and it came in way lower at 13%. And this was amid some other green shoots related to consumer confidence and spending, business investment, and a couple of other things. The current situation, unfortunately, isn't nearly as rosy. And I'm not just talking about the recent surges in coronavirus cases in Texas, California, and other places, including the Pittsburgh region. So let me briefly elaborate, set the stage for our panelists, and sketch out what I think are some key areas of concern for the economy right now. Foremost in my mind is the labor market. Unemployment fell again from 13%, as I just mentioned, to 11% in May to 11% in June. But some important things to keep in mind are as follows. First, most of this progress appears to be rehiring of furloughed workers. A good thing to be sure, but there's little evidence of hiring for new positions. We know that there's going to be a lot of jobs that are lost, and that a key part of the recovery is going to have to involve the creation of new jobs. Second, the labor market participation rate. The fraction of the working age population that are in the labor market fell precipitously in March and April, and has only regained about 1/3 of the lost ground since. And this was after a slow, steady increase since 2015 that many credit as a driver for the thriving pre-pandemic economy. A large exit from the labor force will be terrible news for a recovery. And recent developments in K-12 schooling and daycare availability are certainly bad news along these lines. Third, these and other negative labor market developments are falling disproportionately on the relatively low-skilled and low-educated parts of the population and on racial minorities. Any progress that we've made in recent years in terms of inequality and labor market outcomes now seems kind of perilously at risk. Next, I'll turn to small and medium-sized business activity. Right? Well, it's clear that policy interventions like the Paycheck Protection Program made things a lot better than they would have been otherwise. There's some growing causes for concern. On the small business side, while we don't have hard data yet, real-time estimates from sources like Yelp and social media sites for small business owners are starting to point to business closures growing at an alarming rate. What's particularly discouraging is that a lot of the paycheck protection money has been left on the table, which, when you consider that alongside the recent outbreaks, suggests that many businesses aren't closing because they have to, but because they want to. On the medium-sized business side, the Fed's direct lending program has met with a rather tepid response. Apparently, concerns of a credit crunch faced by viable businesses has been overstated. The big unknown is whether or not this reflects solid balance sheets and alternative sources of financing for these medium-sized businesses, or whether it reflects an anticipated dialing back in business investment because the coronavirus supply shock is increasingly being perceived as a prolonged demand shock looming over the horizon. Finally, on the consumer side, we saw a fairly robust rebound in consumer spending in April and May, but the effect of the recent surge in confirmed cases in parts of the country in the June data isn't known yet. Again, there's some worrying signs in the real-time data being things like measures of mobility from cell phones and survey data, and so on. For example, Well, much was made of a large uptick in the end of June index of consumer confidence from the Conference Board. That survey ended in mid-June, and real-time survey data, for example, from the Pittsburgh-based firm Civic Science, shows a marked decline in consumer confidence since then. And this is a nationwide measure, not just a measure associated with Texas, Arizona, and California. This, in addition to the mobility data from the outbreak regions themselves, affirms what's becoming increasingly clear. To some, it's been clear all along, and that's that economic activity is not a policy choice. Data from both the US and abroad make it crystal clear that any kind of perceived trade-off between reducing the transmission of coronavirus and the level of economic activity is an illusion. Consumers and producers will dictate how the economy recovers, not government mandate. So with this as an admittedly bleak-sounding backdrop, I'm very excited to hear what our panelists have to say. So let's turn to them now. I want to begin with Shubham Singhal. Shubham, what are the scenarios you see for the economic recovery that lies ahead?
Thank you, Professor Telmer. As we look at the scenarios, and for those of you, if you can follow along on the screen, we've looked at these 9 scenarios that basically have 2 aspects that matter. The first on the y-axis, which is the important part here, what's precipitated the crisis, is the spread of the virus and the effectiveness of the public health response. And so that goes everywhere from, broad failure of public health interventions, which is that what folks like Sweden and UK, and some might argue some parts of the United States were trying, which is, we can continue operating and somehow the virus is going to run through the population, all the way, if you go to the top, which is rapid and effective control of virus spread, which you could argue, and while we may not in the US accept some of those aspects, but in Asia and in China, the actions that were taken, which were very aggressive in essentially getting to near zero virus situation. And then the one in the middle is effective response, but there is regional virus recurrence. And I think in large part, this is where we, I think, find ourselves in the United States, if we really kind of think about it. The x-axis is around the effects of the economic policy response. And so the ineffective interventions would be had we decided or differed in making a set of choices around providing the kind of funding, the measures that allow, you spoke to allow for the bottom not to fall out and the entire market to seize up, et cetera, banking crisis precipitated. So I think in large part, what we would say in the US, at least, that has been so far at least avoided. So that's kind of the other parts. And so as we look at these scenarios, you only end up in the V that some people were talking about. If you believe you can get to near zero virus and keep it there, and you believe that the intervention that we take on the economy for the shutdown that we've sustained are extremely effective, allowing for the bounce back to happen, which I think, as you noted, 6 weeks ago, maybe some people might have entertained that idea, but it seems a little far-fetched. Just to put dimension around it on the next page, for the United States, what it gives you a sense for some of these scenarios, and the A1 is the one in the middle, which is the policy responses were somewhat effective and the virus as regional recurrences. If we look at that, that's a 9% 2020 GDP drop. I don't think that's what Goldman Sachs is saying at this point. It's a little more optimistic than that, but it takes us till 2023 Q2 to get back to the same levels as we were in 2019. And so that's kind of the period of time we're talking about. So when people say that we could get to a serious bounce back. Now, the other thing that we've done, you spoke about the consumer confidence on page 3. One of the things we've been tracking is executive confidence. And we've just completed one in July, but this is, up to date on June. And what we have seen is that actually business executives have been relatively more pessimistic than consumers. I think consumers have reacted more in the moment, how they're feeling. And so if you look at this, right, I mean, the one in blue is the US economy and what executives kind of believe on the US economy. The plurality is on A1, which is the one that I mentioned, is a recovery happens in 2023 Q2, which is fairly meaningful. But actually, a fairly meaningful number of executives are actually a lot more pessimistic, and they believe that some of the economic policy responses are only stopgap and are not going to really deliver. And very few, if any, believe in the V rebound, if you will. So, you know, and maybe I'll finish up on the next page on this, which is if you just compare that with what others are saying out there and what the Bloomberg median is and the like, just to put it in context of these scenarios, that's kind of what it is. You know, some of the things at the 10th percentile on the Bloomberg percentile, I think as we look at it, we'd say that's overly optimistic and at least not realistic for the United States to achieve.
Thanks very much, Shubham. Let's turn from kind of the overall economy to the financial markets. Gunjan, what do you see happening in the capital markets in now and in the future, and in particular in the personal investing space as well?
Well, I'll tell you, Chris, first, thank you for having us. Very interesting discussion. And thank you, Shubham, for painting. Both of you are reflecting the pessimism. And I do agree that a lot of executives are worried about what's going to happen. The stock markets, on the other hand, don't seem to be worried. The biggest question I get is this head scratcher around what's happening. And I can explain both a pessimistic and an optimistic scenario. So just some facts to share here. You know, there are winners and losers in what the capital markets are saying to us, although the top line, the headline seems to be more positive than negative. Over the last decade, the privatization of the workforce has been a very real phenomenon. You know, today there's only about 3,500 or so publicly traded companies in the US. That number used to be double that 20 years back. So the stress that is being felt in the real economy, and think about who has been feeling the stress. The small restaurants, the service economies, the barbers, the florists, these are all the small business privately held companies. And the impact of the spend that the consumer does, which normally is reflected in the stock market, is just being cushioned by policy response. So let's talk about policy response, because if you look at what's happening in stock market, they are betting heavily on two things. The technology and healthcare sectors are now 50% of the capitalization of the S&P 500, 50%. And they've done very well through this crisis because everybody has acknowledged that the economy, while it is doing really badly, all of us have taken this giant leap forward in digital adoption, and it will do very well for these giant companies, and healthcare will be fashionable for a long time to come, given what has happened. So who's on the flip side of this concentration? Today, airlines, travel, entertainment, energy, all of these sectors that are huge from an employment standpoint are only 7% of the S&P 500. So the fiscal response has been actually very successful in this crisis. About $1 trillion has been pumped back into the economy and into the hands of the consumers. No trickle down. The $1,200 checks, the extra unemployment benefit, the $500 billion in the PPP loans that has gone. And to put $1 trillion in perspective, at the end of last year, the entire savings of all Americans was $1.2 trillion. So in the last month, the government has doubled the savings rate of all Americans, and they are spending that money, and it's cushioning the blow. So is that good news for the economy? I'm not sure. I think it creates more inequities. And I think the short-term pain, like 2023, doesn't matter to the stock markets that much because it's a discounted cash flow, and 200 basis points of interest rate positive shocks has done wonders for just valuations, right? So I do think that the capital markets are signaling long-term confidence. We are in for a world of pain in the next few years.
Do you see anything going on the personal investing side that's reminiscent of the financial crisis in 2009, or is it quite different?
It's better news. The biggest reason it's better news is for most Americans, their house is their biggest savings and investments. And housing has held up very well this time around compared to last time. You'll remember what was happening with housing.
Yeah.
Mortgages were written more prudently in the last 10 years, and housing values, these people are moving to suburbs. There's a whole sort of reasons why housing has held up very, very well. So that's sort of item number one. The second big investment participation is the 401k or the retirement savings for most people. About 1 in 2 Americans participate, and those numbers have come back. So you don't see, your savings kind of dissipate in front of your eyes. So those two are retaining confidence. The savings rate, Chris, and I'd be very curious to see what you are having. I just can't make sense of the numbers. In May, the savings was at 4.5 trillion, 4 times the average savings. So people are hoarding. The cash is coming in. There are forbearance programs that have been mandated by the government. Most of us in banks are doing some kind of modifications for every type of loan just to provide some liquidity support, and you're seeing that in savings. So the average personal finance is actually not in as bad a shape and could recover if employment recovers. If it doesn't, then what we're looking at is just devastating impact to minorities, to women, to young participants, and almost everybody who was participating in the economy in a little bit of a gig economy style. The Uber drivers are in trouble, the contractors are in trouble. So we'll see how it pans out, but they also tend to be younger. And we always say, if you have time on your hands, that's a wonderful thing. The worst thing that happens is to an older person who loses their equity in their homes. So I do feel the picture has been less bleak this time around.
Thanks a lot, Gunjan. Let's now turn to the operational side. Paul, you focus on business operations with an emphasis on firms in the manufacturing and industrial product sector. Please tell us your views on the path to recovery and how well the U.S. is poised to thrive, hopefully, in the recovery.
Sure, Chris. And John, if you want to jump to that first slide. First, I'd like to just maybe comment on the housing market that Gunjan just talked about. I'm in the process of selling a house, and I've seen more demand than ever before for a house that we couldn't even get an offer on last year. So there's something happening, in the economy and the housing market, and it sure is. It sure feels good when you kind of see all this uncertainty out there in the world. See some green shoots in different places of the market. I think Shubham's comments as well. I think the data that we see from our clients and from our practice leaders as well, kind of think about a recovery that is measured in years from now versus months from now. So that kind of 2023 type time frame is probably a pretty uniform assumption as it relates to the economy overall recovering, not just the consumer side, but the manufacturing side of things. As we think about, and John, maybe just the next slide, if you would, we think about kind of the respond, recover, and thrive phases of this, if you will, pandemic-driven crisis. The surveying that we do has about 70% of the organizations, manufacturers and otherwise, really now in the recovery mode. There's still, many organizations trying to, they're just kind of at the beginning of recovery, whether that's the commercial airline industry or travel, hotel, leisure type industries are still pretty sharply decimated by what's happened on the consumer side of things. But we're starting to see a large number of manufacturers begin to recover, and their recovery has a focus on the work that they do, the workforce that they have, and the workplace where things get done. And we're seeing lots of changes kind of across the spectrum in how work is done, who is the workforce and what does the workplace look like. And, I think the place where we're seeing most of the impacts in manufacturing, if you think about, shop floors and facilities and distribution centers, whether it's with the kind of the large online retailers that are doing some really innovative things with, plexiglass and partitions and one-way travel, to manufacturers who are doing a lot of innovative things that are reversing some of the things that they've done really over the last 3 or 4 decades that have been focused on lean manufacturing and taking out waste and taking out spacing and kind of more densely populating work cells and those kinds of things to make things much more efficient for individuals. Now they're applying those same kind of lean concepts, but really now thinking about social distancing inside of assembly operations or inside of manufacturing operations. And they're really leveraging technology. I think the commentary one of the panelists made on technology is really right on. We did a study last fall that we did with the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation, MAPI, and it basically highlighted, that for the digital or smart factory of the future, how much technology was going to play a role. And I think we're just seeing the pandemic bring that technology investment, accelerated forward. Whether it's kind of some of the apps that people have on their phone right now to, kind of check into work, and those involve a temperature check or a self-declaration as it relates to health. They may involve reserving a workspace, whether that's in an office environment at a factory or in one of the few office environments where people are actually going back to work, or actually, kind of allowing to have building access. We're seeing a lot of these kind of apps, develop that help, from a technology standpoint. But I think one of the big things that all manufacturers, and when I talk to, CEOs and we do surveys of executives, there is a huge focus on people and the health and safety of the people that are there in the factories. Gunjan and I were talking before the call started, and how she would want to get out to see some of the people on her workforce, and they really said, no, don't come and see me. I want to stay safe. You stay safe. That's really a big focus on what manufacturers are doing in this recovery environment, is thinking about how they keep their people safe. There's a lot of adjustments going on to supply chains and sources of raw material and source of components as well, but we'll talk a little bit about that later.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's kind of encouraging, especially when you put how you described the way that things are developing in manufacturing facilities and so on, and you compare that to what's happening in entertainment and bars and restaurants and so on. It's nice to have some positive things to think about there. Let's.
If I can just jump in here,
Gunjan.
None of us have talked about energy, right? So just think about what would happen if energy collapsed by 80% in any of our normal. Manufacturers would have been very, very happy, and so would have airlines. There are these weird positive shocks that are cushioning some parts of the economy that we as leaders really are watching, because it is very confused set of signals. But energy has helped, hasn't it, Paul?
Yeah. You would think though that commercial airlines would love low fuel prices, right? But we can't get people on planes because they're not comfortable getting on planes. But manufacturers in the chemical industry, love reduced pricing in their feedstock, kind of into many of their operations. And I think we're going to see those kind of mixed signals, like you said, that we're going to see for a while, and we're all trying to figure out what they really mean and what the impacts are going to be downstream.
Let's turn back to Shubham and back to the issue of the consumer side of the equation. Shubham, what's your view on what's really going to be key for driving consumer confidence that might lead to a re-engagement in business activity?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's an interesting discussion, right? Because I think on the business side, businesses have been planning, and particularly in more controlled environments, or at least controllable environments like manufacturing and organized business. The real question, I think there's a couple of things, and I think this has been mentioned. One is, if we just start at a macro level again and then kind of dive into consumer, which I think is a relatively fickle set of views on a weekly basis, as we all know. One of the big things that we look at is that the fundamental uncertainty has to be brought down, right, for us to really be able to get back. Yep. And this is where, the responses, again, back to the virus, have a lot of policy uncertainty, right? Now, the state's up first, the local, the federal. Should we wear a mask? Should we not wear a mask? Should we open now? Should we close? Are schools going to open? Are schools going to close? I think those are all fine and dandy conversations to have on a daily basis. What it creates is a level of high uncertainty where whether they are consumers, individuals as consumers, individuals as parents, individuals as workers, it's very hard to really decide how you're going to engage, whether you should feel confident about the economy or not, right? So I think that's kind of the first part here. By the way, there's also uncertainty on, are we going to, given we're headed into an election, get a stimulus? What would the nature of that stimulus be? Right. While I spend the first 1,200, should I now be worried about where the next one comes from? Will there be unemployment insurance? How long? So the first thing we have to do is, both in the economic interventions as well as on the virus side, we have to tamp down the uncertainty. Otherwise, it's really hard for us to really kind of get moving.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we look at is, it's about every week that we spend not getting it under control is close to about $60 billion lost in the economy. Right? It's a very large number. So if you said, I want to spend $5 billion on getting testing so we can just get this sorted, that would be well worth the ROI. I mean, there's no ROI that doesn't work on what you can do to tamp that down, both in the economic side, but particularly on the virus part of it. So that's one of the biggest things. And I think we've had this really difficult time, which again, I go back to some of the Asian economies. I totally get the cultural difference, right? But clearly mandating a set of rules that allow us to all operate. Do we wear masks? And everyone needs to, or you can't be in some place. I mean, those are pretty important things that we have to do. They can seem small, but those will raise the effectiveness. I'll give you one thing from our consumer research that we do. When you segment people out, you have a set of people, generally younger, who have no problem engaging and as we've seen, right, with all the stories. You've got a very significant portion, generally have kids and family, generally skew a bit older, who want to engage, get out there again. They're kind of tired of being in, but they only want to get out when it is actually relatively safe to do so. So if you really think about that, and that makes up 80%, and then there's older people, et cetera, right? That makes up 80% of the folks. The interesting thing is, if you got the first 40% to go out there but all wear masks, as one intervention, not too many, you would get the other 40% confident to come out. But if you don't do that, then the other 40% don't feel like they can. So it's small things like that. But when you look at it, the level of broad policy uncertainty is just so high that it's very hard to see how you get the consumer confident enough to come back out in force.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add to that point in that not just in Asia, I think that we see lots of evidence of the benefits of a more coordinated kind of policy response and behavior, but in Western Europe as well. The United States is just a very decentralized system of government, and getting everybody moving in the same direction, as we've known ever since it began, is very difficult. And that's turning out to be one of the biggest challenges we face. Let's turn back to operations, and I'd like Paul to comment on global supply chains. The vulnerabilities associated with complex supply chains, international supply chains in particular, have played a prominent role during the economic collapse, and of course, the growth in these types of manufacturing processes is been long-lasting and is well known. So, Paul, what's your view on how has the pandemic changed our view? Has it opened our eyes regarding where things are made in the world?
Well, Chris, yeah, I think it's a good question. I think supply chains are definitely impacted on a global basis. And, I'd even step back further to, things like the Fukushima nuclear accident and other things that disrupted supply chains for us, kind of earlier in the years. And that was, something that I think shone a bright light on the length and complexity of supply chains. And some people reacted pretty positively to that and did things to, again, invest in technology to help them begin to sense or understand where the vulnerabilities were in their supply chain. But they were doing it more specifically in certain industries or certain sectors of industries. Heavy equipment companies, I think, did some pretty interesting things with sensing in those, for supply chain disruptions. There were some things that, happen every year for us in the U.S. and other parts of the world when there's a weather-related supply chain disruption that we have to think about, whether that impacts us on the consumer side, when retailers are, selling plywood like it's going out of style to board up windows, or when there's runs on different kinds of food. So this is not the first time we've ever had a supply chain disruption. I know it's the first time in 100 years we've had, kind of a pandemic of this nature, but it's not the first time we've had supply chain disruptions. I think, though, this one is different because I think it's going to drive some more systemic kind of changes, I think, in supply chains. One of the things, again, with MAPI, they've just recently done a CEO survey based upon some of the data that we jointly pulled together last fall, and they've talked about kind of two things that they're seeing CEOs really think about now. One is China decoupling, reducing the dependencies that, on a global basis that we have on China on the supply side of things, and to some extent, making sure the demand side of things is covered with local supply, versus other things. The other thing that they've seen is kind of a focus on onshoring or nearshoring. So it takes a while to adjust supply chains, but we're definitely seeing a reaction, with many of our customers thinking about how they can get, supply, of raw material, supply of components or feedstocks more closely to the point of use versus having them always kind of look for a low-cost labor-oriented market. Total landed cost is something that's, much more viewed these days as something that companies are looking at. They're also, making changes, as I said, on the shop floor. Those shop floor changes, I think are going to even be more dramatic because they're going to impact workers every day, than necessarily those supply chain, changes. The supply chain changes will, help neutralize us from shocks in the future. But I think the supply chain changes that will really manifest themselves on the shop floor are going to be the ones that, have, implications for those people out on the shop floors every day, whether it's, workplace modifications or work rule modifications or modifications to anything, again, to kind of get back to worker safety, because there's a lot of concern at the executive level these days of really kind of keeping people safe, because the last thing any, CXO wants is to be, their company on the front page of a publication, or in somebody's, tweet that they've done something that's caused people to be at risk. So big focus, maybe even an over-index on safety.
One just to kind of add to it, the one thing that we, it's kind of interesting, and Gunjan mentioned that technology has accelerated a lot. One of the other things we believe that's going to accelerate is this thing around supply chains, right? Because if we just zoom back, even pre the crisis, the supply chains were regionalizing already, because gone are the days where China or other Asian countries produce and the West consumes. Those are very large consumer markets that are, have their own massive demand and frankly, a faster growing demand out there. So these were regionalizing already. Labor arbitrage as a source of value had declined to being much smaller. And so I think the interesting thing is this moment, kind of a little bit kind of creates a discontinuity to say, okay, in this moment, can we now just readjust a little bit faster? I think the challenge for when people say the knee jerk, we're going to onshore everything, is how? I mean, you don't have the manufacturing, you don't have necessarily all the supplies, and and the cost may be unbearable for what you have. So it's not that straightforward to do. So I completely agree with the Paul. Yeah. But I think it's a painful restructuring, and in some sense, I think it's a much more painful restructuring for the West than it is for the producing countries. Yeah,
I think if you think about, again, we did a survey 2 years ago with the NAM, focused on skills gaps. And if you think about trying to bring a lot of those things back into the region, we don't have the skilled labor force, that can handle, anything from, the sewing needs, if we were to bring apparel back on shore, to the, kind of the metal bending needs, if we were to bring, white goods manufacturing or other kinds of, light assembly or light manufacturing jobs back on shore. we have a huge skills gap in our economy. And I think, Shubham, you're right. The shock, is going to be tremendous from a supply chain standpoint. And it's going to take us beyond 2023, 24 to really kind of readjust our supply chains to something that feels more balanced. And even though it's been going on, for a number of years, it's a long process for sure.
Yeah, just thinking a little more broadly, thinking about trade in general. When we think about the explosion in trade that's happened over the last bunch of decades, we tend to emphasize net trade flows, current account deficits, and so on. But of course, the gross flows that happen in the world, one country selling tennis shoes to another country and then receiving a different kind of tennis shoe, dwarf the net trade flows. And so I think a really big unknown is how the gross trade flows are going to be affected. And then, of course, that's got enormous implications for the capital markets, for all the gross and net trade and financial capital that's supporting trade. So I think the implications for international trade are are a very large unknown. Let me turn back to Gunjan and think about kind of management more broadly. Gunjan, we've certainly all given a lot of thought to leadership, the importance of leadership during the pandemic. What are some of the biggest challenges you see facing corporate leadership as we go forward?
Shubham very gracefully captured the dilemma of uncertainty that people are feeling, and businesses are pivoting their strategies under enormous uncertainty. It's just one topic to talk about international trade, but we would have spent months thinking about how your strategy pivots based on that assumption. So I will tell you, as we have kind of journeyed as a leadership team through this crisis, our first phase was really crisis management, and I think by and large everybody did well with it. Unlike the last crisis, I thought there was more empathy among leaders. There was a very quick set of reassurances around layoffs that I think did in some way stem the uncertainty early on. And the technology advancements did allow an enormous amount of at least white-collar workers, as Paul says, to work from home, which also helped the security and soundness. So I would say that that phase was done well, and it is done at this point. We are looking at a grind at this point. There was a time when return to office was the big planning. We've all acknowledged that there is no scenario in which 100% of our staff gets crowded into trading floors anytime soon. Even if we get a vaccine in 3 months, it takes years for the fear to sort of leave the system. So here we find ourselves with some real differentiators around what leadership will mean. And the first is just we are all tuned into our people in a way that is so personal and unusual. I have to tell you, I would be very nervous of picking up the phone to an employee and saying, "How is your health?" That just now I do, because it's an important part of what they're thinking about. And so that's sort of different from a skill set standpoint. We're spending more time on people's mind shares. There's a lot of discussion around the corridors around mental health support. Isolation is a very real issue 5 months into this lockdown. All new territory for leaders. Then there's hard strategy under uncertainty. There are some things that are certain. If you were running towards a more digital organization, we are sprinting at this point. Our consumers have adopted technology in startling ways. I'll give you a tiny example. For a long time, banks have had the technology for consumers to take a picture of their check and deposit it electronically. But somehow checks are like masks. Like there are people who love them and people who hate them. And those who love them will not take a picture. So we have not had adoption more than like 25, 30%. In 3 weeks, people needed to deposit their checks. 80% of the people are depositing their checks digitally, and they're not going to go back. So there are some things we know we need to do, like digital, but for everything else, what does globalization mean? What we'll wake up to a completely different consumer need. The spend shifts. So that's another. I think most importantly, the workforce is completely different. I don't think we'll get anybody to get excited about waking up at 7 o'clock, taking a shower, getting into a car, sitting in a commute for an hour in New York, and then getting jam-packed in a tiny cubicle where people are breathing on you. It's not going to happen, like for a long time to come. So what does that mean for commercial real estate? What does that mean for suburban complexes versus urban tall buildings? Are all things that are very present suddenly among leaders. So all I can say is, at least my personal mindset is to dictate less, to just simply be a learning, listening leader and create optionalities so that we can respond very quickly and very empathetically to how things unfold. And I will tell you, we have some leaders who just sort of really struggle to log into Zoom, and I don't think they'll be leaders very much. I will tell you, there is a real implication to personal skill sets and personal comfort with how we work in this remote environment that I think will make quite a lot of shifts in leadership. But those are just thoughts. I'm sure our audience and all of you have your own versions of what we're observing among
It's
leadership.
probably a really positive outlook for Cleveland and Detroit and Pittsburgh and not New York, Gunjan. I don't know. But
Never count out New York, Paul. Never count out New York.
Okay.
If you
I also heard
a really cheap apartment, go buy it, because it is a resilient city, like it is a resilient country. So I suspect we are at some point in a different way. There is some different type of activity that comes.
I heard a similar story to your adopting kind of digital banking from someone also in the banking industry, and they were reflecting on something in higher education, saying that higher education was able to digitize 20% of their courses over 20 years, and then they took 20 days to digitize the other 80%. So that shift this past spring really kind of drove. I know my youngest daughter is going into her senior year in college. I know that's kind of driven her crazy too, as we're trying to, as you all know from Carnegie Mellon, working through how do we bring kind of, children and young adults back on campus in a safe fashion. So it's an interesting thing for all of us with, kids in college or high school or elementary school, whatever it may be.
It's interesting, Paul, you say that, because one of the most intransigent sectors that I spent time in healthcare, we went to a 200x increase in telehealth visits, which doctors and patients would say, oh, that can never be, I got to see this person and so on. And then very quickly that's moved in the conversation.
I know I did my first one during the pandemic. I caught poison ivy and got my cell phone and showed to my, dermatologist, and she sent me a prescription that we did electronically too. So
and now once people have tried it, many don't want to go back, right? So one of the things I'd just add, Gunjan, you mentioned this. As I talk to a lot of the leaders, one of the things that comes out, and we completely agree on the empathy and all that part, but the one that comes out is speed. They're like senior executives are absolutely stunned how fast they and their organization have been able to move during this time compared to what normal is. And so a lot of them then ask the question, well, what, can we just do this? Like when we going forward, like, it's, you get the 4 people you need on Zoom, you make decisions, you move on. And that I think will be another interesting thing. Is this a moment that fundamentally the way we design organizations and decision-making in organizations, which I think honestly was designed for a pre-digital industrial era, just shifts fundamentally, because we've seen what we can do with, with remote, with the ability to connect, with transparency of information, et cetera. And so that I wonder is going to be perhaps one of the bigger challenges for leaders on how they lock in that speed. Because if someone else has that,
I can tell you, if I don't have to present a PowerPoint to 7,000 people in person ever again, I'm signing up for that. Some of the bureaucracy that has gone out of our the heritage of how businesses are has been very sort of healthy for us.
Well, this is a really interesting conversation. You people have some overwhelming challenges ahead of you. We've got just about 10 minutes left. And so John Sengenberger, I know that we've got some questions from the audience, and you're organizing those. So can you take the role as questioner for a second? And John, leave me just a couple minutes at the end to talk to our panelists about the importance of the Tepper Alumni Network in the times we're living through.
Sounds good. Thank you. We have a number of questions, so we're going to have to go rapid fire answers here. But there were a number of questions on education, the economic structure of higher education. Will that be fundamentally changing? And then a second question related to it, the panel's thoughts on schools reopening and how that affects business and the workforce. Will we see significant changes where parents need to stay home to take care of their kids?
Okay, rapid fire, the education question. Here's a contrarian view, as opposed to it's the Harvards and the MITs and the CMUs that are going to be okay. Maybe skills will be a much more important aspect of the educational product as opposed to branding and networking. And maybe this is bad news for your elite schools such as Carnegie Mellon. Panelists, any views?
Well, we'll keep hiring people who are educated, whether they did it digitally or in person. So if there are any students out there, I would say, worry about the real things, just learn and develop skills, whether you do it digitally or physically.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a focus on lifelong learning. I know, John, you've always trumpeted that from a Tepper school standpoint. And I think, the ability to have kind of digital lifelong learning as people's careers, probably continue to change at a more rapid pace. Very few people stay in their job 30 years like I have at Deloitte, but we're going to see people taking 15 jobs in that same 30-year time frame next, and continually refreshing their schools through whether it's elite universities or skill-based educational opportunities. I think it's going to be hugely important.
How about the schools for the workforce, for the grade school and the high school students?
Look, I think that is going to be one of the things that holds back. Now, just to put it in context, we're talking about 25-30% of the workforce where they wouldn't have an option, if you will, if schools were not meeting in person as to how they could have childcare, being people either both working or single parents, et cetera. Now, a good number of them, as Gunjan said, most business leaders I talk to have no intent on bringing people who can quite productively operate from home back till we get beyond this. So, at least those can continue. So as the challenge is really for those that do need to work in person and will feel the acute need of not being able to go into work. So it's a real problem, and it's a real problem at a family and a human level. It's not a, kind of across the labor force, if you will, in broad terms in the economy problem.
Very good. There are a couple of questions on the economy itself and just understanding how consumer spending might affect the stock market if unemployment stays double digit for a year or two, and what you think is going to happen with the stock market and interest rates.
Well, if I could really predict it, I would not be on the panel. I would have my private island, which would be COVID-free. So, but I'll tell you, consumer spending has long been the biggest driver of kind of stock market returns. And our savings rates are high. The fiscal stimulus is very high. Right now, if you were to read the signals of the capital market, they would assume that especially in an election year, you're not going to let the consumer truly tank. So we're expecting a massive, and this is not just the US, across the board. Every central bank has stepped up in a faster way than they did 10 years back, and it has cushioned the blow. So the question is how quickly the recovery happens. And in the end, it all comes down to the chart that Shubhan shows. When do people feel they can be safe, the behaviors can protect their health, and there is some normalcy coming? But right now, the stock markets would say that will get figured out through policy response.
Yeah, I mean, Gunjan mentioned earlier a big increase in the savings rate. And so I think a big unknown is whether or not that is going to continue. And as we've been talking about, whether or not that's eventually going to turn back into consumer spending and cash flow. I'm the finance professor here. And when I look at just a simple discounted cash flow approach to is the stock market overvalued, the answer is just resoundingly, obviously. It's you've got cash flow divided by cost of capital, and it's really hard to tell a positive cash flow story. And now coming back to the uncertainty, it's even harder to tell the cost of capital story. It seems like it's gone way up, which is going to depress valuations. So I think telling a fundamentals-based story for rationalizing why the stock market is roughly where it was at the beginning of the year. What are the fundamentals that account for it being there about now is just a really difficult story to tell.
But the conversation that happens is that the dividend yield of S&P 500 is 3%, and there's no other yield anywhere in the industry. The government is standing behind. It's a good investment for the next 6 months. So there's a little bit of just search for yield, and is this the best place to park your money? It's no less crazy than what we're seeing everywhere else in the economy.
Just to put a sharper edge on it, if I were to overall simplify the scenarios, etc., if we can get the virus under control, whatever that means, right? I mean, just kind of get a public health response, etc., to be consistent prior to there being a meaningful hit to our credit and banking system, so the credit markets can be quite open, I think you can be quite positive, right? The question is, if we drag this along, that we've got to be in this limbo land for too long. I don't know, Gunjan would know better, how much throwing money at the problem from the government can hold us at bay before we actually cause real damage to the system.
Well, inflation is under control, right? So that's going to be the trigger point of a real next downturn. If you start seeing significant increase in inflation, which reduces the value of printing the money, which is but against the inflation increase, we have shocks to energy. So right now there's a period of plausible soft landing. But you're right, if this continues for 2 or 3 years, then you get into structural damage. So I do think the race to a solution is an important question.
Yeah, and certainly the enormous increase in government debt brings into question Gunjan's point about inflation risk.
Correct.
Yeah. Let me, since we're almost out of time, let me just close with one last question for all the panelists. An important reason that you people chose to do an MBA in the first place was to join a network of colleagues and friends like the Tepper Alumni Network. And so what are your thoughts on what this network means to you, especially during these times of great disruption? And is there any advice you can give to the more junior members of our network in terms of how the network can help them get through these extraordinary times, and how they can help others get through these extraordinary times via the network?
Well, maybe I'll jump in, Chris, and just because John knows I'm a huge networker and a big user of LinkedIn and staying connected. And whether it was through being the president of Bob Damon's Dean's Advisory Board, or just being an active alum who's been recruiting on campus for 2.5 decades, to, being heavily involved in, our local chapter in Northeast Ohio. I think the power of the Carnegie Mellon and Tepper School Network is incredible. And it's also, you get out of it what you put into it. So if you put into it and invest in it, I think you will have, a tremendous response from alumni around the world or around the country. I know there's rarely a city that I go to that I don't connect with a Carnegie Mellon alumni in one way, shape, or form, whether it's me actively reaching out, or I happen to be in a business meeting, it ends up being somebody in the manufacturing world, ends up being a CMU person. So, I'm a huge advocate of the network, a huge advocate of, the university and all that is brought to me. So I'm really happy to give back at any time. And if anybody wants to reach out and connect to me and see some of my funny haircut pictures or mullets on LinkedIn, please reach out. You're only laughing because you haven't seen them yet, Gunjan. So.
Well, let me jump in and then maybe Shubham can, so I don't know if you know that, but Shubham and I worked at McKinsey. We were partners in the Pittsburgh office. So, networks are overlapping and interconnected because that's what the power of network is. So I would just say, don't underestimate the need to invest in it. And I would echo what Paul says, is it's not just about taking from it, but you have to strengthen it. Do your bit for the school. The stronger the school is, the stronger your personal network will be and your value will be. So I, like Paul, feel an enormous sense of gratitude for where I am, for what the school did for me. And in my own way, if there's something I can do, it feels like a very, very easy and worthwhile thing to do. So thank you, is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo it. I think it's well said, so I have not much to add, but I will say the number of people that I work with, both at the firm and outside, and frankly, even the interconnectedness of the networks, right? I mean, I wouldn't be at McKinsey if it weren't for Gunjan and Aravind. My first engagement was with Chris Leach. I mean, it's just sort of, and he and I still continue to work together. And so it's actually quite important from that standpoint. The one plug that I will also make rather shamelessly, and hopefully there aren't alumni from other schools, but I would tell them to. The other thing that Tepper really did was it actually provided, to the point we made earlier, real skills and a real education, not just reading up some case studies. So I think that matters a whole heck of a lot, that, when you're going into recruiting or looking at a Carnegie Mellon student or alum, you have a pretty good sense that they actually come with some hard skills and not just the soft stuff.
Well said, from the perspective of one of the teachers of those skills. Well, I'll just close on my end by offering sincere thanks to the panelists and saying that I found this really insightful conversation, and I hope that a lot of our audience has as well, and has taken some insights in terms of how to go forward in their own both personal and professional life. And I'll hand it back to John Sengenberger to sign us off.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm really proud to be able to have our alumni on the program today and give you an idea of the quality of our Tepper network and how impressive they are and what they're accomplishing in their careers. And so we hope you'll all stay connected with us. The only thing about this webinar that I felt was lacking was the amount of time. I think we needed another hour with all of you to ask more questions, and the volume of questions we got from our alumni is there. So we'll have to have a part 2 a little bit later and see where we are then. But thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you on another one of our Tepper alumni webinars and all the ones that are being provided by Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.